Gables, Chapter 9. The Tea Party. "I'm going to a meeting," Marilla said to Anne one Saturday morning in October. "If you like, you can ask Diana to come over. She can spend the afternoon and have tea." "Oh, thank you," Anne said happily. "I have longed to have Diana come to tea." "You can open the little jar of cherry preserves and have it with your cake and cookies," Marilla said. "And there's half a bottle of raspberry cordial left over from the church sauce. It's on the second shelf of the sitting room closet. You and Diana can have it if you like." After Marilla had driven off, Diana came over. She was wearing her second best dress. She knocked primarily on the front door. Anne, wearing her second best dress, opened the door. The two girls shook hands as if they were meeting each other for the first time. Diana put her hat in Anne's room. Then the girls sat in the sitting room. "How's your mother?" Anne asked, trying to sound so grown up. "She's very well, thank you," Diana said. "Is Mr. Cuthbert hauling potatoes down to the ship this afternoon?" "Yes," Anne said. "Our potato crop is very good this year. I hope your father's crop is too." "It is fairly good, thank you," Diana said. "Have you picked many apples yet?" Oh, ever so many," Anne said. Then she forgot to act grown up and jumped to her feet. "Let's go out to the orchard and pick the rest of the apples." They picked and ate apples until Diana started to talk about Gilbert Blythe. Anne didn't want to hear about him, so she said it was time to go back and have some raspberry cordial, and finally found a bottle marked raspberry cordial at the back of the top shelf. She put the bottle on a tray with the glass. "Help yourself, Diana," Anne said. "I don't want any after all those apples." Diana poured herself a big glass of cordial and sipped it. "It's awfully good, Anne," she said. "I didn't know raspberry cordial was so good." "I'm glad you like it," Anne said. "Drink as much as you want." Diana drank a second big glass of cordial. Then she drank a third. "This cordial is much better than Mrs. Lynde's," Diana said. "It doesn't taste a bit like hers." "Of course, Marilla is better," Anne said. "Marilla is a famous cook. She's trying to teach me, but I'm a great trial to her. One time I found a drowned mouse in the plum pudding sauce. I took the mouse out, but I forgot to ask Marilla what to do with the sauce until she brought it to the table. Then I remembered the mouse, so I shrieked, 'Don't use the sauce, Marilla, the mouse drowned in it.' And we had company too." "What's the matter, Diana?" Diana stood up unsteadily. Then she sat down and put her hands to her head. I'm awfully sick," she said. I want to go home." "But you can't go home without having tea," cried Anne. "I'll get it right now." "I'm dizzy," Diana said. "I want to go home." Anne got Diana's hat and walked with her as far as the Berry Yard fence. Then Anne cried all the way back to Green Gables. her tea party had been a disaster. Chapter 10. Mrs. Barry Gets Mad. It rained all day Sunday, so Anne couldn't go out to play with Diana. On Monday afternoon, Marilla sent her to Mrs. Lynde's on an errand. Soon Anne came running back up the lane, crying. She dashed into the kitchen and flung herself on the sofa. "Whatever is wrong now, Anne?" asked Marilla. Anne sat up. "Mrs. Lynde went to visit Mrs. Barry today," she wailed. "And Mrs. Barry said I got Diana drunk on Saturday. She said I'm a bad little girl. She is not going to let Diana play with me ever again." Marilla stared at Anne in amazement. "Got Diana drunk?" she exclaimed. "What on earth did you give Diana to drink?" "Nothing but raspberry cordial," Anne sobbed. "I never thought that could get people drunk." "Fiddlesticks," said Marilla. She marched to the sitting room pantry. There on the shelf was the bottle marked raspberry cordial. It was the bottle Marilla had used for some of her famous homemade currant wine. Marilla remembered that she had put the bottle of raspberry cordial in the cellar instead of in the pantry, as she had told Anne. She went back to the kitchen, chuckling a little in spite of herself. "Anne, you certainly know how to get yourself in trouble. You gave Diana currant wine instead of cordial. Couldn't you tell it wasn't cordial?" "I didn't taste it," said Anne. "Oh, Marilla, Mrs. Barry thinks I did it on purpose." There, child, don't cry," Marilla said. "You weren't to blame. Just go to Mrs. Barry and tell her it was an accident." "I don't think I could face Diana's mother," Anne said with a sigh. "I wish you'd go, Marilla. She might listen to you." "Well, I will," Marilla said. "Don't cry any more, Anne. It'll be all right." But it wasn't all right. Anne could tell from the Marilla's face when she came home. "Mrs. Barry won't forgive me, will she?" Anne asked sadly. "Mrs. Barry, indeed," snapped Marilla. "Of all the unreasonable women I ever saw, she's the worst. I told her it was a mistake and you weren't to blame, but she simply won't believe me." With that, she marched off into the kitchen. Marilla slipped into Anne's room later that night. She saw that Anne had cried herself to sleep. "Poor little girl," Marilla murmured. She lifted a loose curl of hair from Anne's face. Then she bent down and gently kissed Anne's flushed cheek. The next morning, Anne came downstairs carrying her school books and slate. "I'm going back to school," she announced. "That's all there's left for me now that my best friend is gone forever." Marilla was surprised but glad that Anne had finally decided to go to school again. The girls welcomed Anne with open arms. They had missed her. Ruby Gillis passed 3 plums over to her. Ella May McPherson gave her a huge paper pansy. Katie Balter gave her an empty bottle to keep scented water in. The girls weren't the only one who were glad to see Anne. after lunch and found a big apple on her desk. She was about to take a bite when she remembered that that kind of apple only grew in the Blythe's orchard. Gilbert Blythe had left the apple on her desk and dropped the apple as if it were a red hot piece of coal. Then she wiped her hands on her handkerchief. Still, Anne was happy to be back at school with her friends, but she had to sit with Minnie Andrews. She missed Diana very much. Diana might have smiled at me once, I think, Anne said to Marilla that night. But the next morning, a note and a small package were passed to Anne. The note read, Dear Anne, Mother says I am not to play with you or talk to you, even in school. It isn't my fault, and don't be mad at me. I miss you, and I don't like Gertie pie one bit. I made you a bookmark out of red tissue paper. They're very fashionable right now. Only 3 girls in school know how to make them. When you look at it, remember your true friend, Diana Barry. Anne wrote back, My own darling Diana, of course I'm not mad at you because you have to obey your mother. I will keep your present forever. Minnie Andrews is nice, even though she has no imagination. But after having been your best friend, I cannot be Minnie's. Yours forever, Anne or Cordelia Surley. P.S. I'll sleep with your letter under my pillow tonight.